We wanted to measure Colombian attitudes towards transitional justice during this peace process, which means what do Colombians think will be a legitimate outcome of the peace negotiations in terms of holding the combatants accountable for human rights crimes. That was the major focus. Transitional justice are the measures that countries decide upon to end a civil war or to move from an authoritarian government to a democratic one. How to deal with human rights abuses that may have occurred during that conflict, but in a way that will lead to peace.
One of the really innovative aspects of the survey was to include not just abstract questions about the FARC here, the FARC there, but to use what were invented case studies. So for instance, Felipe was a commander. He ordered people under him. He committed atrocities and oversaw the killing of 500 people. He has expressed remorse. He says he's sorry and will pay reparations to victims. How much did people feel that they would be willing to have anything to do with this man, to have him live with them again? What kinds of effect that had on how they saw the FARC in the peace process? Then you would have someone else, for instance, Federico. Well, he was just a low-level combatant, followed orders, joined because he thought he was getting in on a struggle for social justice. He's apologized, feels terrible about what he's done, etc. What this did was took the monolithic category, FARC guerrilla, and disaggregates it. And I think that is so important. I've argued for that with my work with paramilitaries and with every other group, armed group I've worked with. We have to disaggregate these monolithic categories to understand the complexities, the variations according to rank, who gave the orders, who obeyed, sometimes overly zealously, who obeyed because there was a gun to their head. They didn't want to, it was do it or be killed. And these kinds of nuanced understandings, assessments, and ascriptions of guilt are so important because they open up a space for people to see some kind of humanity in groups that frequently are demonized in the midst of combat. And it helps us understand people do have very subtle ways of assessing who do they really think is guilty. And do they show remorse? Do we really believe it, or are they just saying it? Are they willing to conduct some kind of redress to make good on the harm that they've done? So I think that is a part of the survey that will be picked up by many other people doing work on transitional justice and perceptions of the mechanisms.
Do you know?
That there are certain international agreements as to what should happen. So that in the past, historically, many such civil conflicts or transitions from an authoritarian government where there were abuses by the government were solved by granting amnesty, mutual amnesties often, let's say between guerrillas fighting against a military government. But today that's no longer allowed because of international agreements, and Colombia is a signature to these international agreements and so is required to have some punishment of any of those who committed these grave human rights abuses.
So transitional justice, if we think about the classic literature on it, most people would trace it really to the Nuremberg tribunals, which at the time, of course, were extraordinary, and they opened up a very different way of thinking about a rather internationalization of justice. And then we could look at another phase, which was the range of democratic transitions that occurred around the world following the 1989 reconfiguring of the globe. And then I would argue that as you get to the end of the 2000s, the end of the 20th century, that's when you begin to see this becoming more of a norm and not an exception. That you are expected, this is the changing norms internationally, that you are expected to do something with the perpetrators. Do something about that violent past so that people have some assurance that it won't repeat.
Well, we found that also asking about what kind of punishment would be appropriate for the grave human rights crimes, especially by the commander, that most people did not want to have the result of no jail at all. They wanted some kind of punishment. But they agreed that for the FARC guerrillas, it should be similar to what another combatant group who were the paramilitaries and had signed a peace agreement with the government about 10 years ago, that they should be treated more or less equitably. This was different, again, than the main traditional survey question, which found that the public wanted the FARC to be treated more harshly, with many more years in jail. What we found was that trust, especially in the parties to the conflict, that is, right now, the government and the FARC guerrillas who are sitting at the negotiating table in Havana, Cuba, trying to end this conflict. Trust in those two were the most important in determining whether or not people support the peace process in general and the specific mechanisms of accountability or transitional justice that might be forthcoming. Trust in the other institutions, the courts, etc., or in other actors, even former President Uribe, did not have as much effect. So what this means is that those two parties, the FARC guerrillas and the government itself and President Santos, by their own actions that might increase trust in themselves, can also increase trust in the peace process. Alternatively, if trust falls for either the FARC or for Santos, then support for the peace process falls.
And I was curious if trust is a proxy, perhaps, for something else, and that is a sense of security. I firmly believe that security is one of the key concerns that everyone talks to me about when I'm in Colombia. The sense of insecurity is huge, and security in its fullest sense. A security that, well, if those people from whichever armed group I was in disagreement with, if they live here, I have some reasonable assurance they're not going to come in the middle of the night and kill me. Right? So trust, to my mind, may be a bit of a proxy for getting at a sense of security, which means that we are more able to tolerate one another because I'm less afraid of you, to put it very colloquially. And I think security is a huge part of what people are reckoning with. So that when you look at the reintegration, for instance, of ex-combatants from the paramilitary, from the FARC, from the ELN, people want some assurance that if those people come and live here, they're not going to go doing the kinds of things they were doing before. So we can call it trust, and I think, sure, to some extent it's trust, but I also think it's just a basic human need for some kind of security.